Welcome to Unsettling Queer Anthropology. This is the second event in the year-long speaker series, Queer Globalizations. I'm Matt Brim, Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center in the City University of New York. Thank you to our guests today, Brian Horton and Scott Morgensen and Ann Spice, and a very special thanks to the organizer of this outstanding and timely series, board member Margot Weiss. Thanks also to the many attendees who are coming to the Zoom room. Thanks for your interest in Unsettling Queer Anthropology. Thank you for sharing not just your time with us, but for sharing your vision. Our vision at CLAGS is that we believe in free, accessible LGBTQ studies for everyone. If you can, please lend your support to us by going to our giving page and donating today. We have a special donor who has pledged to match up to $250 in donations that we raise at today's event. So please, if you can, give. We really can't thank you enough for all the ways you show your support to CLAGS. It is now my pleasure to introduce Margot Weiss, Associate Professor of Anthropology and American Studies at Wesleyan University. Margot also coordinates queer studies there. She is the former co-chair of the Association of Queer Anthropology and has published widely in anthropology, queer studies, and American studies journals. Her books include the prize-winning Techniques of Pleasure, BDSM, and the Circuits of Sexuality, published by Duke. Last year, Queer Then and Now, the David R. Kessler Lectures from 2002 to 2022, that came out from the Feminist Press. And just recently, Unsettling Queer Anthropology, Foundations, Reorientations, and Departures, also published by Duke. Margot, thank you so much for organizing this series, Queer Globalizations, and for moderating today's event, Unsettling Queer Anthropology. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. It is my pleasure, my excitement to be with you all today for this event. This series, the inspiration for this series was the 25th anniversary of the 1998, so the inspiration was a few years back, of a really important CLAGS conference called Queer Globalization, Local Homosexualities, Citizenship, Sexuality, and the Afterlife of Colonialism. And I think in the chat, you can actually look at that poster for that conference, which was really cutting edge in thinking about what queer globalization meant then. So our series, and you might know the book that came out of it, which we talked a little bit about at the launch event, Queer Globalizations. And so the rest of the full series and all the events in this series take up the questions that occupied people back in the end of the 90s and brings them to today. So really thinking about globalization and queerness in political, epistemological, methodological frameworks, new work in queer and trans studies that is global or postcolonial or transnational, what that might mean today, especially in terms of the political issues that are facing us right now. So we have events coming in December, in February, and April. We have events on settler colonialism and indigenous queer solidarity politics, on provincializing queer and trans studies from elsewhere, on Global South interventions in queer and world anthropology. So that might especially speak to the anthropologists in the room today, and queer and trans asylum and migration. There's a link tree, excellent, awesome, it's in the chat, to register for future panels, to take a look at everything that is happening. Also, you can subscribe to the CLAGS email list, follow CLAGS on Instagram, and get all of the CLAGS info. And as we start, I want to thank our co-sponsors for the whole series. This is a CLAGS series, but it is made possible by co-sponsorship from American Studies at Wesleyan University, the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium, Feminist Studies at UC Santa Barbara, the Orfalia Center for Global and International Studies at UC Santa Barbara, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Amherst. So thank you so much to our co-sponsors for the series. So today we're taking these questions, exploring questions opened up at the intersection of anthropology and queer and trans studies, and jumping off from the new book that Matt mentioned, which gave us our title today, Unsettling, Queer Anthropology. I have one of my copies here by me. And I think have maybe a link to the book coming into the chat, and also a coupon code for 30% off the book if you're interested. Book came out in 2024 from Duke, and it explores new directions in queer of color decolonizing anthropology. And each of the fabulous panelists with us today, Scott Morgensen, Ann Spice, Brian Horton, have chapters, great chapters in the book that they'll talk a little bit about in a moment. And then we'll turn from the particularities of this book to broader questions about what global queer studies looks like from the vantage point of anthropology and the politics of queer and trans anthropology today. And with plenty of time for Q&A, we aim to have at least 20, hopefully 30, depending on how brief we can be, minutes for Q&A at the end. So just to give you a brief snapshot of the book, Unsettling Queer Anthropology emerged from conversations that I have been having with friends, with colleagues, including the people here in this room, and I can see some of the people also at this event for years, about really needing something in our field in queer anthropology. I had in mind Ellen Lewin and Bill Leap's canonical 3-part volume on gay and lesbian anthropology, and a book that really showcased what queer anthropology was, is, and could be. And it really has a longer history than is often imagined. And I wanted it to put forward crucial new directions that I saw as really central to what queer anthropology can be or is today. And that's queer of color critique, postcolonial and decolonizing theory, work that really starts from or takes as foundational newer work in trans studies, in disability studies, in Black studies. So I put together a dream team of contributors, including these folks today, who each have different approaches to queer anthropology, but are all working from an intersectional approach. It was less about a kind of world atlas style, like regional approach to queer anthropology, and much more thinking with people whose work is grounded in decolonizing, queer of color, critical approaches to anthropology. Thinking about how sex, gender, and sexuality retain multiple relations to power, including the normative operations of the discipline of anthropology, which often marginalizes critical perspectives from Black, Indigenous, and other anthropologists of color, scholars working in postcolonial, feminist, crip, and trans studies. So the book has 3 sections. The first is a foundation section that gives a sense of the history of queer anthropology, but it has 3 chapters. So it tells 3 different histories, 3 different foundations that try to dislodge a more canonical origin story that we might all be familiar with. Multiple genealogies and multiple legacies that I think maybe Scott will be sharing a little bit more with us today about that. The second section is reorientations, thinking about queer anthropology's contribution to fundamental topics in anthropology, kinship, performance, that's Brian's chapter, language, the transnational, the state. So places where a new approach, a queer of color decolonizing approach to anthropology might actually reopen up those canonical areas at providing like new orientation points and new potential directions. And the last section is called Departures. It's about queer anthropology otherwise, a Black, trans, crip, feminist, Indigenous, queer of color centered queer anthropology that is accountable to community beyond academia, and really thinks with deeper relations, responsibilities, and really seeking a departure from more extractive models of knowledge production. And Anne's chapter is in that section. So the book is meant to, provide a kind of framework for the field, but one that's asking big questions, not just about queer anthropology, but also about what queer means, how to think about culture, difference, alterity, the problems of US-centered theory, methodology as a way of reading, thinking, study, knowing, what ethnography can do for us in this moment. And I ended up calling it Unsettling Queer Anthropology after a lot of back and forth and a lot of which everybody on this call knows about, and a lot of questions about what the right kind of aspirational title for this should be. But I really wanted to unsettle the grounds of a white US-centered theory and practice of anthropology. And so Unsettling kind of landed on as a way to think about pushing beyond some of those more taken for granted forms, um, uh, modes, methods, unsettling those assumptions, but also the forms of anthropological knowledge production that many of us here today are really trying to rethink, challenge, refuse in different ways. So those are the provocations from the book that I wanted us to think together a little bit about, but also bring forward into, a bit of a broader conversation today. This is when we're thinking about anthropology, the history of anthropology, we're thinking about colonialism, imperialism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy. That is a story about anthropology that a lot of people know, and it's not, of course, confined to anthropology, but certainly anthropology is one of the big players there. But we also, I think, can think about how queer and trans anthropology has long been a site of refusal of other possibilities, especially to resist, rethink the kind of false universalisms that can be common in a lot of queer studies and a lot of queer theory. So to really ground knowledge in that from elsewhere, and that is Maya Mikdashi and Jasbir Puar's language, beyond like the global north, beyond like English departments, beyond, they frame it in terms of like queer studies as American studies, right? So how does anthropology's method, ethnography, and its particular approach to like grounded knowledge making, to the local, to the particular, contribute to a different global queer studies? Does it shape the questions that we ask differently? Does it provide a different vantage point? So with that, I think I'm going to turn to our amazing panelists. We have with us Brian Horton, Scott Morgensen, and Anne Spice. For reasons of time, I believe everybody's full bio will be pasted into the chat so you can explore the amazing work of everyone here with us. And maybe each of you can share a little bit about your contribution to the volume, thinking about it in terms of the global queer studies or sort of where we are today. Brian, do you want to start us off? Awesome.
So I can start first. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Zoom is always weird. I feel like I'm talking to an audience that is just like the Borg, the hive. It's out there and I can't see it. But so this was an interesting opportunity for me to sort of go through some kind of post-grad school trauma. I feel like I came to this volume probably 2 to 3 years out from being a PhD student. And I was really excited when I was invited to have the opportunity to submit a chapter, but it was also going through an incredible amount of imposter syndrome in terms of trying to figure out well, what exactly is my relationship to performance and performance studies? Do I actually understand what performativity is? Have I been misreading Butler this entire time? And I think that as I put this chapter together, one of the things that I was thinking about as just kind of a sort of meta goal was, if I was a graduate student who was encountering some of these terms for the first time, and maybe even for the second or third time. I don't know how many times gender trouble was assigned to me in graduate school, and I still don't feel like I understood it until I started teaching it. I thought about how to write a chapter that could introduce students to some of the concepts and key debates, but also accomplish what I think are some of my own personal and political goals around shifting the center of how some of these terms and concepts get taken up. So, for instance, in my field site, or in my field, I am, it is not surprising to me that I often see the reproduction of white Western queer theory as queer theory and as what counts as queerness from institutions in the Global South. And a question that has been a provocation for me in terms of my dissertation work, the book I'm working on, and ultimately what comes out in this chapter, is how might some of these concepts be able to do different work if queer of color critique, if performance studies, if other fields are kind of interjected into the mix. And that's no shade to some of the earlier disciplines. It is for me what I see as the kind of implicit reproduction of certain kinds of whiteness in the academy that are reproduced globally. And so I think, particularly around the way that performativity has been taken up and the kind of citational genealogies that have gone alongside it, my chapter is sort of asking, if, okay, we can take Butler, we can read Butler, but why aren't we also reading E. Patrick Johnson's work, for instance, on performance? Why aren't we also thinking about materiality? I think part of that also comes out of my own sort of frustrations with the ways that sometimes the conversations that we have in anthropology and in queer theory and in queer studies more broadly are so beholden to the category of the discursive. So how the things that are done with the body can or cannot create or become sort of subsumed by these kinds of larger discursive forces that are so beyond our control. And I think about the kinds of things that I saw in fieldwork and and I use this word a lot in my writing, the very ephemeral things, the things that are just kind of here and then gone that people do with their bodies. So whether it's touch, whether it's a gesture, whether it's the kind of shimmer of a sequin on an outfit that's worn in a place, you know, where one might be challenging the norms of respectability. And I think about, and I wanted to think about how to account for those things and how in some ways the queer of color scholars that I've been thinking with gave me a stronger vocabulary for talking about that than some of the kind of more canonical texts. And so I'm never a believer in sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I wanted to also think about how to bring some of these things together. So my chapter is really trying to, on the one hand, explain the kind of longer debates around performativity, but also insert into those debates the ways that we might not lose the performance element, so the material elements, the kind of ordinary things that people do with their bodies and with other people's bodies that might be, you know, that could be everything from the exceptional to the non-exceptional, and to think about how those things offer a really crucial grammar for thinking about politics, for thinking about pleasure, for thinking about life. That's one of the other sort of places where I think my chapter and my larger work is trying to intervene, is to say that, you know, queerness is not only queerness in the places where we recognize suffering and use suffering as the kind of primary vehicle for understanding queerness. Queerness can also be pleasure. It can also be enjoyment. It can also be the complexities of pleasure and enjoyment in a time and place where suffering is happening. And so I think that some of the vocabularies that have been given to me by scholars that I really value in performance studies, especially in queer of color performance studies, have really helped my thinking, and it sort of helped me craft this chapter together, which I hope that you'll read. And I think that's probably like 5 minutes, and that's enough for me. I'm happy to say more in Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. I'm in alphabetical mode, I guess. So Scott, do you want to go next? Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. And thank you everyone for organizing this event and for coming. It's wonderful to be here. I admire my colleagues who can speak extemporaneously. I don't know where I lost that capacity at some point. I ended up writing out a comment. It's going to read a little bit more like a conference paper, but it's very short. So forgive me for sounding more dry than everyone else, and I will be much more chatty later in the discussion. So my task in my paper was to recall the histories of the study of sexuality and social science, which in queer anthropology includes the anthropology of homosexuality that informed the discipline from the mid-20th century. So reflecting on these histories, and notably on Kath Weston's detailed accounts of them, I considered how this volume might already be modeling fresh entryways to asking what they might teach our moment. And many of the volume's contributors invoke the generations of effort. We see it within feminist, Black, Indigenous, Global South formations of anthropology to reframe genealogy, whether that's for a field or a discipline, or within alternative interdisciplinary intellectual formations that counter tales of disciplinary unity. So with that energy, which also shapes my own work in the field of gender studies, I looked to some official histories of sexual social science, but prior to the rise of an anthropology of homosexuality. And I was guided by an interdisciplinary model for reading entanglements among official and insurgent knowledge in Lisa Lowe's account of the intimacies that animate global histories of modern violence. So Lowe's intimate analytic really helped me illuminate where sexual social science inscribed what she calls liberal intimacy, that individuated sexuality, gender that advances its humanization within liberal social order, even as a science remains subtended by what Lowe calls the emergent alternative intimacies of collective struggle that exceed modern violence and disturb its premises. So my chapter tried to bring this analysis into two cases. First, turning towards the early project that Weston called ethnocartography, a long word that's worth learning how to use. I followed her interest in Bronislaw Malinowski by asking how his early ethnographic contributions are refracted by his posthumously published diaries. So here in the diaries, Malinowski's violent dismissals of and desires for his Trobriand hosts interweave with his fervent auto-analysis that aspires towards a civilizational sexuality that always remains just out of reach. Yet, even as the text suggests a relation between this appeal to liberal intimacy and his projections of savage sexuality, the text, the diary, records his Black Indigenous hosts refusing his projections and signaling discrepant knowledges, which thus subtend the text even as they also remain just out of its reach. A second story I read turns from primitivism to what's sometimes called the first ethnography of modern sexual minority communities. And this is the work of psychologist Evelyn Hooker, who created a depathologizing account of homosexuality by documenting her relations with friends and activists in mid-20th century LA gay men's communities, and with the support from the Mattachine Society, which had just formed there. When Hooker's accounts uplift the white, class-advancing gay men who formed the center of her study, the racial and economic socioscape of LA lingers just out of view, and indicating how appeals for her subjects to accede to liberal intimacy exist in relation to the lives not recognized for scientific humanization or for rights in the state. Yet an intimate analytic suggests that more might still be learned of what might be made visible or invisible if ethnography follows in Hooker's legacy, which was a depathologizing activist ethnography of sexual minority community. So my chapter's reflections on ethnocartography and on the ethnography of modern sexual minorities entertain the possible complementarity of the racializing containment of sexual primitivity on the one hand, and the more deracialized advancement of sexual modernity on the other. But engaging with Lowe's intimate analytic also highlighted her emergence from broader conversations on postcolonial and decolonizing methods, and to which this elaboration of genealogies and queer anthropology contributes, to which it contributes, and which our volume is taking part. So in a moment, we'll be talking more of how themes that emerge in the book relate to global perspectives for queer studies. And while these perspectives range, they precisely range beyond the official histories that my chapter revisited. They're also writing from within and about relations that refuse restrictions, that surpass borders. And interdisciplinary methods like Lowe's intimacies and queer ethnography are helping scholars meet those relations and understand what they teach. So thanks for letting me share a little bit about the chapter. And thank you, Margot, for making this happen.
Thank you so much, Scott. Anne?
I just had a flashback before we start, as Scott was talking, to a class on feminist ethnography at the CUNY Grad Center. And I had to present Scott's book, Spaces Between Us. And I remember just stressing so much about having to introduce like settler colonialism, decolonization, and queer studies in one class. And it like went horribly. So I'm sorry, Scott, for not being managing to get all the themes in your book across to my classmates. But I think it also speaks to the chapter that I've written here, and what I have experienced as a personal and professional tension between Indigenous studies and queer studies that I hope to kind of work into in the chapter itself. So the behind the scenes story here is that when I started spending time at an Indigenous land defense encampment in northern British Columbia, that's when I came out as queer. And I had this experience of being surrounded by queer anarchists in a space that was predominantly meant to support Indigenous sovereignty and reproduction. And people kept asking me why I thought that was the case, and I had no good answers for them. And even as I wrote my dissertation, which is now eventually becoming a book, I just dodged the question because I couldn't come up with a satisfactory answer to why this space continued to draw queer people into a space of Indigenous land defense and a really localized territorial movement for a specific form of Indigenous sovereignty. And so I was thinking about that and thinking about what are the overlaps between a queer politics and Indigenous politics, and how did I see those emerge in my own research. And as I was thinking about that, and as I was considering writing the chapter for this book, I was also pregnant with my first child. So I really had all of the issues around, reproductive futurity, Indigenous futurity, queerness. Like it was just like all happening like in my body. And so I wrote into this chapter, and it really centers around thinking about temporality as the meeting ground of queer and Indigenous politics, and a politics that pushes against a capitalist acceleration towards apocalypse and disaster, towards capitalist time and straight time, which I think in this case lay aside each other and are sort of supporting each other as this drive towards catastrophic climate change accelerates. and how that form of temporality, that teleology of disaster, how those are challenged fundamentally by Indigenous time and by queer time, and then how those two align. And so I was wrestling with Lee Edelman's concept of no future and thinking about how sort of queer reproduction could lead us towards a more expansive idea of futurity, and how that's such an uneasy theory to think alongside Indigenous temporalities, where we're constantly talking about the next generations, having had our own ability to reproduce ourselves attacked along multiple different vectors. And so thinking about queer time, sort of more aligned with Munoz's formulation as a horizon, queerness as futurity, something that we're always pushing towards, and then trying to think about how that aligns itself with Indigenous time as a cyclical time that is attentive to both past and future in current decision-making. And so I center the chapter in a Tlingit phrase, hashagun, which is sometimes used to denote our history or our ancestors, but it also has a future orientation. It's what we have been, what we are, and what we will become. And it is meant to be a way of framing current decisions with the past and the future in mind. It's an orientation to time. And so thinking about queer orientation and Indigenous orientations to time as aligned here and as forming a more cyclical, seasonal rhythm than this drive towards capital accumulation, and I think disaster, and as thinking about queer life and Indigenous life as challenges to that in the way that we sort of brought ourselves to the front line of Indigenous land defense. And I think the sort of end point, and I'm not sure I quite got there in the chapter, is to really think about our loving and caring relations with both past and future ancestors, and expanding our circle of care, and expanding our chosen family to not only include the people of the present, but also honoring our ancestors and future generations, whether or not we are ourselves involved in biologically reproducing those generations. I think that's something that when we think about queerness and queer politics, that we can align that with Indigenous goals, them both, and stack them both up against the threat of climate change and apocalypse. So I'll turn it back to Margot, and Margot, maybe you can talk a bit about your chapter as well before we move on to discussion.
Thank you, Anne. I was hoping to get away with less. No, I'll be super brief. My chapter is in the first part of the book, along with Scott's and along with Jafari Allen, who has a genealogy of queer anthropology that's centered in the Black radical tradition. So these like three, different approaches to origins, to foundations. My chapter is about deconstructing the story that queer anthropology is the child of queer theory, which comes from the humanities, and anthropology or ethnography as like a method. And this gap between what counts as theory and what counts as data or evidence or description. I was interested in a few different things with this. The first is what counts as theory and queer theory, what counts as ethnography or data, drawing again on Puar and Mikdashi's work in queer theory and permanent war, as well as Kaguro Machiara and Jalia Mrundakar, Howard Chang, other people who have really thought about where we cite theory, both like with the S and the C, like where queer theory comes from. And that part of my argument and what I'm kind of trying to trace out is that part of the way that queer theory becomes American studies, kind of falsely universalized, is through this abstraction, that it kind of comes from no place or it comes from every place. So it's right, the level of circulation isn't tied to any particular, grounding or form of emplacement. Whereas data, something like ethnography, is only that emplacement, only the local, only the cultural, only the data. So that dynamic obscures a number of things. So one thing is what is written out when we forget that queer anthropology is actually the origin point for a lot of what we understand as canonical queer theory. So that, for instance, is, Esther Newton's ethnographic work, which lays out a theory of performativity that Judith Butler takes up in their work, citing Newton. But Newton's work wasn't just the data for Butler, but actually the theory, right? Which I think, Butler acknowledges, but that story is kind of written out. Newton was doing that work. I mean, that was published in 72, right? From her 1968 dissertation. I also talk about Gail Rubin's work. I think Gail is with us tonight. Thinking sex as a kind of empirical theory making that really lays out what comes to be understood as queer theory's anti-normativity and how that anti-normativity is framed. And I talk also about transnational queer studies and these other places where the work of anthropologists and really grounded, situated theory making is actually central to these origin stories. The point, though, isn't to be like, haha, queer anthropology is the best, like we were here first and you guys should read us again and remember that we're anthropologists. Not just to say that, or not really to say that, but to really think about like what is written out of the story when this lineage when it isn't framed this way. And that is the debt and the obligation and the responsibility and the relationships that are in the ethnographic work that helped formulate those theories. So like thinking really about the people that Esther was talking with in her field work as like really central to how then we'd later go on and think about performativity. So that's what ends up being erased from the lineage. And that's with like thinkers like Kaji Amin and Michael Himes Garcia, who are really pushing us to think about queer studies, queer theory, and canonical origin stories differently. So we have some relationship to the people who are at the kind of center of this work, but who are kind of written out. And of course, like that work itself, its particularity reproduces certain kinds of whiteness, certain kinds of urban centeredness, like all of the elisions and points that, obscuring things that are in that work are then reproduced, but yet we have no way to kind of address that, rethink it, or reframe the field if we're not acknowledging, where it comes from and grappling with what that actually means for us and how we might think differently about it. So, yeah. So underlining how all theory comes from somewhere, the dismissal of the empirical, the kind of caricature of what the empirical means, and that's something that Gail has written a lot about, and how that perpetuates false universalizations that obscure really grappling with or reckoning with these multiple genealogies that I think we want to be accountable to, or we want to think through when we're thinking about different kinds of queer studies. So that is my chapter. And thank you so much for all of these links in the chat, but maybe I can jump off from there to ask, we have kind of two big questions, and I'm gonna ask because I want to hear the brilliance from Scott and from Brian and from Anne. Two big questions to kind of frame a conversation. And the first one is about the place in anthropology, place of anthropology in global queer studies. My thoughts go to that like kind of empirical question and what is erased, but I think it also, it's also a question of what global queer studies or queer globalizations, as a series is called, looks like from the vantage point of anthropology. At the launch, Maya Mikdashi said, we really need to ask like where and when is the global, like what global are we talking about? Because that global looks and is really different in different places. So yeah, what's the place of anthropology in this? What do ethnographic approaches or anthropological approaches, and those aren't necessarily the same thing, kind of yield? Curious what you all think about that.
If we're shy, you might have to call on us.
Well, Scott, that I'm calling on you.
Okay, but I'm not going first next. I love going first. It's okay. Actually, I still love going last. So just whatever helps. I thought when this question was raised to us that it brought two themes to mind. You mentioned both of them already, and I love the way that you put them. One is that genealogy is still a living question when the global and queer anthropology come together, because it's asking about what histories are thought to be the origin or the generative force for this project. We're going to use this category queer anthropology, but it might continue to sound kind of singular if it's said and heard in that way. Even though we at this table, I'll call it a table, are certainly not doing that. So, I do like, I love the way that you were able with the contributors to assemble a volume that models what global queer anthropology could be, and also where it's reaching and where it hasn't yet touched as the contributors themselves are speaking that. I'm also aware of some other projects that are in the works right now that are actually doing that effort to demonstrate what a queer or a feminist ethnographic project, for instance, would look like if it was collected and led by voices of queer and feminist ethnographers from and working in the Global South. And that conversation will be its own model. And it will also read differently than our book for that reason. So, so I think this question of genealogy will still be alive. The other thing that came up for me was just about how when I'm trying to encourage my students, we're talking about their practice of ethnography, to remind them that it's not just that ethnography is going to provide a contribution to a global queer studies project, but that the method itself might open up our understanding of the global and the queer in the global, or the global and the queer, in ways that other methods wouldn't necessarily reveal in the same way. It's not that it's an exceptional method, it's just distinctive. So it's interesting to like look at the different ways that ethnographers who are working in these fields are already modeling this for us. And to wrap up my thought, some people that came to mind were Saad Atchan and Mohammed Abdu, working with transnational activists. And so showing how the queer works in an activist context. So activism leads the movement into engagement, but ethnography reveals sometimes more than the politics itself would have revealed if ethnography wasn't involved. And also love remembering Khalif Fajardo's brilliant ethnography, in which he studying trans-Pacific shipping staffed by Filipino seamen. He presents himself on container ships and finds through the relational dynamics that result that there was a queer trans story of relations mediated by multiple forms of manhood that aren't working in a binary fashion between himself and other seamen, and that story wouldn't have been told if someone hadn't put themselves into that context of studying trans-Pacific globalization and global capitalism through this frame. So I'll pass it to my colleagues.
I can go next. I actually struggled with this question a lot. I feel like I struggled with all the questions. I can't tell if it's like mid-semester brain or or what. I do think one thing that to go back, I'm looking at the question to see the phrasing. Yes. One thing that I think queer anthropology can look like or can do for sort of global queer studies is that I think queer anthropology really allows, and I think that maybe that might be the anthropology part of the queer, I don't know. I think that it allows for a certain kind of waywardness. I think about the way that field work really unsettles and ungrounds you theoretically. I feel like when I went to do my field work, I had all of these lofty questions. I had, you know, my sophisticated theoretical explanations for things, and I was completely turned upside down by the things that people said to me, the things that people did, And I think that there's a way that, and again, I don't mean this as any kind of disrespect to other disciplines. I do feel like there is something about the kind of practice of having to go out into the world and talk to people or observe people or engage with people as a means of thinking deeply about something like embodiment, sexuality, gender, etc., that just does something to the way that you think, and that does something to the way that you write about those experiences. And so I do think that if we're thinking about what ethnography offers to global queer studies or global queer theory, it is a kind of, and I say this, it's a kind of human socially produced humility, right? And I say that in the sense that it's a way that like concepts have to be, especially in this day and age, politically viable and relatable to the lives of the people that we're writing about and writing with. And I think that that's one thing. And I realize that that is incredibly romantic and whatever. And there are plenty of time, if there's time, we can get into all the sophisticated critiques of that. But I do think that that is, for me, at least in my experience, the one kind of essential thing about queer ethnography that I have felt sometimes is lacking when I'm sitting around seminar tables in different departments and in different fields. I actually think in some ways the inverse of this question, and I'm not trying to critique the question, I actually just think, I will say controversially, I don't know that global queer studies needs queer anthropology in the sense that even in the sense that we are global queer studies, right? If everything is true about the history of anthropological thought to the development of kind of queer theory, queer studies, we're essential. I actually feel like in some ways, since this is an anthro table, we can speak about the elephant in the room, which is anthropology. I think anthropology actually needs us even more in the sense that I look at departments and I look at places where graduate students are educated, and there are, I can count on my hands, maybe 10 of us who are teaching in like major PhD granting institutions that are sending, colleagues out to secure tenure track jobs in other places. I think about stories of graduate students who come to me, not just from my own institution, not from my own institution, but from other institutions, or who are thinking about working with me, who have been pushed out of anthropology because they are interested in doing this kind of work. And so I wonder if we might also hold space for the inverse of this question as much as the kind of global queer studies element, because I actually think that's where some of the real kind of volatility and political work can happen. And then last thing I'll say about this is it reminds me of Esther Newton in Margaret Mead Made Me Gay has that, there's the letter that I think that she wrote to the AAA or to PhD granting institutions about the state of queer anthropology. And I assigned it last semester. And I feel like it hasn't changed. Like, I really think you could take off, I think it was like 1993, you could take off 1993 and put 2024 on that letter. And I'll stop here.
I think I can echo, I can echo most of what Brian's just said. I was thinking about the moment when I was going through my PhD studies, and everything that we read was claiming to be queering something or decolonizing something. But the queer people and Indigenous people were not always present in the analysis. And I think that what this volume does and what project that we have now is to really bring it back into people's lives. And I mean, I'm preoccupied, as I think a lot of us are, with issues around like global climate change, which is a globalizing force that is threatening to destroy us all. And I think that there's something about dealing with that very abstract, complicated political problem in ways that bring it back to the social and the intimate and the personal, and that we have just a hell of a tool belt in queer anthropology to do so, and that leaning into those gifts is something that we can bring to those bigger political issues, and that the force of abstraction that's pushing us into the realm of kind of like dealing with high concepts when these are actually like really tangible material impacts on people's lives. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
Those are great. Thank you all so much for that. I was really thinking about how even in that first conference, anthropologists were so central to, you know, queer globalizations as it was first framed. And I really think Brian's point and what Anne's also underlining, I mean, turning it back towards anthropology. I mean, one of my secret hopes is that non-queer anthropologists would read the volume and get a better sense of what queer anthropology has actually contributed to these canonical fields, right? That you wouldn't actually have the study of kinship without queer anthropology, that you wouldn't, you know, but it's still, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, and your final thoughts right here lead into the next question, and it's the last question before we turn to Q&A, and there's lots of great people here. It'd be wonderful to have a more open conversation, but that's really about politics. I think for all of us, doing queer anthropology is also political, but that can mean different things in terms of thinking about the discipline, thinking about how ethnography might intervene in climate change and, you know, the war on Gaza, you know, what are the contemporary political situation that we find ourselves in, for our own work, for the field itself. How do we think about the politics of the field? And I kind of want to just ask you to speak a little bit to that. How do you see your own work in queer anthropology in relation to those broader politics? How you situate the field in what's happening? Yeah.
I like going last, but I'll go first this time, just to
Thanks, Anne.
keep one for the team. I'm a lurker, and then I like to sum it all up. I was thinking about solidarity when you raised this question, and one of the dangers in thinking through queer politics along, and one of the sort of, I think it's a danger and a potentially really generative space, is that we owe so much debt to essentially identity politics and the advancement of you know, queerness as something that we can hold alongside a series of other identities. And I also see in political movements, in a really material and empirical way, the pull to identity as an individualizing force. And I think that is so dangerous. And I think that where we find the strength of queer politics is in our collective ability to seek solidarity with other equity-seeking groups, and not just solidarity alongside them, but to actually see where the overlap is in our shared struggle. And that the theorists who were thinking, and the activists who were thinking about identity politics as that was coming up, they were thinking in that way, and we lost grasp of it somehow and have turned it into this individual thing, which I think can be really atomizing and individualizing in a way that I've seen at least really be detrimental to the collective interests of Indigenous people seeking autonomy. So I think there's sort of a danger and a strength in our history, and we can kind of notice the moment we're in right now and try to work towards the collective politics. And you know, that's something that we can kind of dig into in our work.
Am I in the middle of the sandwich? Since I can go into the middle. I actually think about this question a lot, and this may not be the most satisfying answer, but I think about it primarily in terms of teaching, and primarily in terms of how the discipline is reproduced, which obviously does not just happen in the classroom, it happens in publications as well. And I think for me personally, a lot of it has to do with the kind of citational politics that are at play in not just what is written as anthropology or as queer anthropology, but how it's taught. I think that part of the work of the sort of neoliberal university is to convince us to manufacture difference as a way to sustain our fields as fields. And I get that, yes, but it's also, in some ways, I think comes at a detriment to being able to think cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinarily about certain problems, to go back to what Anne said about the kinds of problems that we are being faced with in the 2024 of things, necessitate a kind of interdisciplinary thinking that is beyond just sort of, you know, calling ourselves interdisciplinary because we all cite Foucault, right? Like, I think that it means something much richer and much broader that I do think queer anthropology has to some extent been at the forefront of. And I think that in order for us to continue that, it has to be us constantly checking in and pushing and challenging, right, the kind of conventions of the field. This is why I say in some ways queer anthropology has such a beautiful an opportunity to be so wayward in terms of how it deploys the term queer. I think about some of the recent books that have just won the Ruth Benedict Prize, and how, you know, there's a kind of interesting shift that's happening in terms of the kinds of topics people are writing about, the kinds of approaches to queerness. And I think that that is, to me, where we might have the most to say about politics, right? Because we can show the ways that queerness, normativity, power, you know, trickle down into everything from the relationship that people have with religion to, you know, burial practices for trans people. And so I really think that for me is the sort of promise of queer anthropology in terms of its political orientation, is to hopefully push against and do away with and some of these kinds of disciplinary boundaries that feel to me sometimes very arbitrary. Like, I literally feel like sometimes I'm struggling to make up excuses to differentiate anthropology. Like, don't ask me what the difference between anthropology and sociology is, because I don't know that I could tell you. And I realize that, again, that may be sacrilege, but here we are. So yeah, I'll leave it there and hand it over to Scott.
This is such an engaging conversation. Thank you both and everyone for what you've shared. Something that you said earlier in the last conversation, Brian, really resonated with me when you were talking about how ethnography is an embodied practice and a relational practice, which is what I felt like I was hearing both of you and Anne in particular speaking to. That often comes up for me. I mean, Margot, you asked a question that's dear to my heart because politics were what I brought into anthropology. I was part of a cohort. I learned from my cohort about how we could challenge the field to respond to political urgency by remaining politically accountable and practicing and trying to practice solidarities within the field, precisely when the politics that we embodied, that we wanted to bring into being, were in a very complicated and possibly toxic relationship with the field where we were trying to practice them. So, and yet people stayed. And I know that one of the reasons why I stuck around until I left, which is back to your point, Brian, about how people have been dispersed out of the field. But one of the reasons why I stayed and then continue to call myself an anthropologist, even though I've never worked in an anthropology department since getting my PhD, is ethnography. And it's because working in interdisciplinary gender studies all this time and working in a very deeply politicized field that's all about trying to practice accountability across differences and constantly needing to transform not only its history, but its present in order to achieve the futures that these politics are envisioning. I get students who want to learn ethnography. Oh, by the way, I don't know if people are interested to know that not only is there an anthropology department at my university, and never has been, but for many years, about a decade, I was the only person with a PhD in anthropology employed at the entire institution. And so when I'm talking about ethnography, I'm always talking in a context where the word anthropology is usually a non-starter, but ethnography is an interdisciplinary method. So by talking about ethnography and feminist ethnography and queer ethnography, we're able to have these conversations across differences in training and ways that we communicate. But just to the point, like one of the things that happens is that politically engaged people will come to our department or to me and my colleagues who teach ethnography with an intention to like, I want to use ethnography because, and then there's these politics that are motivating it. And I know what that feels like, but I kind of want to say, well, yes, let's do that. And remember that when you're practicing ethnography or politics, it might change. Like, not change in the sense of the way that the political activist is afraid, oh no, something's going to be taken away from my commitment. Is that the experience changes our experience of our politics. And the experience is relational. So you're actually learning from other people and from other people's relationships to possibly the same politics you hold, and but often others. And to the extent that ethnography is an ethical practice about entering into relationship and becoming accountable and responsible, not just in the moment of research, but forever, then there's sort of an accountability to being ready to be transformed. And so I would love to have more conversations about how the ethnography, not again, as you said, Margot, not all anthropologists are going to use ethnography. It's not the center of all anthropological thinking or writing, and it doesn't need to be. But to the extent that ethnography is important to queer anthropology, as you were just saying, Brian, so well, you know, and so powerfully, there's this sense that ethnography needs to, we need to allow ethnography to show us things that the politics that brought us to it wouldn't necessarily have revealed all by themselves. And maybe that's one of the ways that ethnography or queer anthropology could contribute to this desire that we all still have to make scholarly contributions to political movement and create real political change.
That's beautiful. Okay. Demon muted me. Now I'm unmuted. Okay. That was fantastic. Thank you three so much for those reflections, for your eloquence and brilliance and provocations. And we have about 25 minutes, which I think we should all be really patting ourselves on the back for Q&A. So I really would love to hear from folks who are here. You should be able to raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself. And if you want, you can paste a question into the chat if you're in a situation where unmuting doesn't really make sense for you. But we'd love to be able to like open this up a little bit, have a conversation, hear a few questions, comments, thoughts about queer anthropology. We have a lot of queer anthropologists in the room, so you know, your thoughts too on all of these questions. Should we unpin ourselves so that, I don't know if we can do it ourselves, but maybe if we can be unpinned, then we can see each other more? That might be nice. Keeping ASL pinned, right? Or in the corner, or
It'll take up the whole screen. So anyone who is focused on ESL, please, if you could pin a mark for yourself, that would really help.
Great. Thank you, Smaran. Thank you so much. And thank you to Smaran and Cassandra, who have been doing all of the tech and the chat and everything during this. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, I can. Oh, should I raise my hand?
Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. The presenters, thank you so much for presenting. I really, I learned a lot, and I enjoyed the conversation as well. So I'm coming from an education background, pedagogy curriculum, but I was told about this event because I took a course, a Black feminist course, where we were doing a lot of ethnography. We're reading a lot of ethnography work, like Black women writing about their lives. So I'm interested to know, I am really interested in the idea of interdisciplinary. I don't know who said it, but it was really poignant for me in order to kind of make sense of today's world. I cannot think in a silo. So I come often to other departments to like hear what they're thinking about and working with. Sorry. So if we if I'm interested if we can talk more about interdisciplinary with queer anthropology, and also how queer anthropology could be used as a method, or if that's a thing, I don't even know. Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you.
Does anyone want to start with that? Or maybe we could take like 2 questions and then start a conversation?
Margot, there's a question in chat.
I see it, yeah. Great. All right. So the question in the chat is about our thoughts on the interstices of everything discussed today with critical disability studies, disability anthropology, including notions of crip, time, and space. So those are 2 big questions about queer anthropology as method, about interdisciplinarity, about thinking across disciplines, and maybe should we start? Let's start, because I taught today too, so I can't retain information for that long, I have to say. So I can say just a tiny bit about critical disability studies, disability anthropology. There is a chapter in the book on crip anthropology that Aaron Durbin wrote, and it really challenges the model of anthropology as the lone anthropologist who is hypermobile, as they put it, travels, elsewhere to study folks who are immobile themselves, like they are in-placed, right? And that whole model undergirds all of sort of classic depictions of field work. They make the argument that anthropology has considered disability studies, but only as a kind of object of study rather than a crip intervention that might challenge how we do anthropology and how we understand subjects and objects beyond that kind of fixed approach. And so they make an argument for collaborative approaches, mixed ability collaborations that really would open up different possibilities for the kind of research that we're doing, like our methods and really what we're doing, and also acknowledge the different things that people bring, both to like generating research and like all of the aspects of research projects, and that they argue would be really like a crip anthropology rather than just like taking up those thematics or a few of those like more conceptual arguments, but really like living crip anthropology. So that's just one chapter, and that's one, but it's an interesting question for a field that I don't think is really fully grappled with not just disability, but with crip critiques. Do other people want to speak to the question of interdisciplinarity or queer anthropology as method? And then I see we have a couple of other questions too.
Sure, I could just chime in quickly to Emmanuel's question. Thank you for both of you for asking your questions. And I do personally find many students and emerging scholars in education at my institution and in Canada more generally taking up ethnography and using ethnography to do critically queer and queer trans research. So whether that work is identifying itself as anthropological or not, that could be more of an open question. Like I had mentioned a moment ago at my institution, if people are practicing ethnography, they're probably not identifying themselves within the queer anthropology genealogies that we've been naming today. But
Can you repeat the book again? Sorry, Scott.
Sure, I'll type it into chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Maybe, yeah. The preface is beautiful. I'm just noting Savannah wrote a preface that's an invitation to the book. And also there's a mixtape, a playlist that you can find on the Duke Press page for the book. Matthew, do you want to ask your question? And then I think Kevin is actually in the queue, but you've got your hand up now. Great. Yep.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew. I'm an associate professor at University of Maryland. And thank you for this really interesting conversation and all the CLAGS upcoming conversations as well. I know a lot of my students are excited about it, and it's just a great space. So I actually wanted to comment on something that Brian said, Brian Horton. And, I mean, I think the question around like, what does queer anthropology, or what does queer globalization look like from the vantage point of anthropology? In other words, what are we bringing to the conversation? And your point that in some ways anthropology needs us more than global queer studies. And I can't agree more. I mean, I'm at University of Maryland, which is a PhD granting institution. I'm teaching a queer anthropology class for the first time in the department's history, and I've only taught it twice. It's like a mixed level undergrad grad class, and I've noticed, I get more students from outside of anthropology than I get anthropology students, right? And I'm wondering if other panelists or other folks present here, just as audience members, want to comment on what specifically we bring methodologically, theoretically, epistemologically, to conversations like to discussions within queer studies, and then how we overcome the kind of multiple barriers within our departments and within our discipline, including sort of the positivist drive of the IRB and grant-making institutions. I hate to ask a question that's like, how do we stay relevant? That's not what I'm asking. I think what I'm trying to ask is something slightly different than that. But I hope that makes sense, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts. Thanks.
I can jump in on this one since it was directed to me. Hi, Matthew. It's nice to meet you. And congratulations on teaching the first queer anth class. That's major. I think so I hear two parts to this question. The first part, where students are concerned, I've noticed that one, anthropology kind of seems to get a bad rap sometimes from colleagues in other departments. Like, I've definitely been in situations where I've spoken to students who were like, oh, you're an anthropologist? How could you be an anthropologist? It's such a colonial discipline. And it's like, well, English is also quite colonial, especially if you read the kind of colonial histories of South Asia and the history of the British novel. History can be quite colonial too. Like the word discipline, if you follow Foucault, right? It's not exactly a pleasurable word at all times. So I think one thing is that students sometimes come into anthropology with a kind of presupposition about the field. It's beautiful stories. It's not theoretical enough. I think Kath Weston has that really beautiful short essay in The Long Slow Burn. I think it's called Theory, We've Got the Theory, that sort of talks about, in some ways, this problem, that is that the way that the academy has devised what counts as theoretical and therefore brilliant is usually esoteric stuff that was written by French men. And so we have reduced, not we necessarily, but the academy has reduced the complexity of what can be theoretically valuable knowledge. So ethnography is often written off the table as just like the fluff in between citations of French post-structuralist theory. And I think that that's not what we should be doing. I think in the disciplinary end of this question, so in terms of like departments and the university, I feel like that's such a, my time on the job market and my time now on the other side of the table seeing what happens on the job market has taught me that like the kind of political economy of the anthropology market is sort of saturated by people who approach queer anthropology as if it is not only fluff, but I've literally heard things like, why study that? Why not study this other thing? Why is that even valuable? It's funny, I keep mentioning this book because it just shook me up again. I taught a couple of chapters from Margaret Mead Gay, and it just really hit me in the face for how little things have changed. Like hearing Esther Newton's story about her tenure process was mortifying to me, but also not surprising when I have heard anthropologists at other institutions talk about queer anthropology and what queer anthropology is and why it's not intellectually valuable. The late Kenneth Payne story was even more heartbreaking for me. Someone who was instrumental in using ethnographic methods to help produce a kind of response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, and he never managed to get a tenure track job and passed away before he could. It all of it kind of points to me in the direction, which is why I say the field of anthropology needs us more, because in some ways the things that we're doing are not translating and are not being taken up and are not being regarded as serious. And you see it in terms of how people are selected to enter graduate programs, who gets hired, what kinds of things are taught. And to me, I see those things as valuable questions that have to be asked by us, especially those of us in power. So yeah, that's my sort of my half-brained response to your question.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Kevin, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Kevin. Thank you so much for all your thoughts today. This has been brilliant, and I'm learning so much just from listening to all of you. It's really cool. My friend Sebastian, who's also here, told me about this class today, so I'm very happy to be here. I just got my doctorate from CalArts in music, so I'm sort of an interdisciplinary scholar of queer studies and dance studies, music. Started out mostly a musician and then became a scholar over the course of my PhD and started to write and research more. That's sort of my background. And something you were talking about earlier when you mentioned identity politics and how they individualize people and atomize people is something I've been thinking about so much like the last couple years, especially after seeing how sort of like the if I could say like the Tumblr identity politic movement of thought, of the way that people kind of like formulated identity politics through that website and sort of influenced like an entire generation of queer people. That sort of way of thinking and how it where it ended up, where it left us, you know, if I could like generalize in that way. But yeah, I guess I'm thinking about how something that I grapple with myself often is like the newer generations of queer people, and this is something that I'm sure older generations of queer folks go through too, is that like the younger generations don't go through exactly what the older generations have been through. And specifically, you know, the US, like things have changed for queer people. And for me, sometimes it feels like, you know, Gen Z, their way of interacting with queerness is so different than my way, that it's sort of like, it is this like shocking sort of ethnography that happens when I interact with those students, or when I'm in those, you know, dance spaces, for example, because I'm a DJ as well. And so, yeah, and like thinking about what Brian said, also like when you were like, you can have all this theory, but then the ethnography sort of shocks you. I guess my question is like, how do we, and this isn't just directed at Anne or Brian, but anyone, like, how do we grapple with this like new sort of like, I don't want to say, I feel like saying untraumatized is like very generalized, but like the traumas that older generations of queer people go through are not the same as the newer generations. And I feel like how does that look in anthropology, in queer anthropology and ethnography? And how do you like connect those generations despite those differences? Because I think that impulse for individualization and identity politics comes from, in part, like those traumas, you know? Yeah.
Oh, that's such a good question, and such a tough one. Like I feel old every time I think about it, because I'm like, how can I not connect with the younger generation of people? I'm struggling so hard, but I think it is part of what we can do, like really concretely, is be in intergenerational conversations. Like I think it's so important for people to talk to older people and younger people about what they're experiencing and how those experiences are different, and find the points of solidarity there. I think there's a cautionary tale in indigeneity that's been taken up in much similar ways in terms of its currency as an individualized identity, and then the tokenization of Indigenous people, especially within the university, especially in Canada, which is where I work, where reconciliation politics is such a powerful force, and it does the work. I think it's always important to look at what work it does in terms of our connections, our political connections to community and to the collective. Is it encouraging me to seek an individual benefit, where instead I should be seeking to return to my responsibilities in the group that I'm a member of? And so I think we have to find ways to kind of gently guide people towards those questions, because if we're not gentle about it, we get canceled. But I think it's a real challenge, and I think it means we have to have those intergenerational conversations and talk about the way things were and the work that people did, like the real work, because this kind of work required a lot of bravery, and still does in many ways. And I think people step into it now, and we have to prepare them for what it means to step into it, because as we've been talking about, people aren't getting these positions that we want them to get. It's not being sort of moving forward in the way that we wanted to move, in terms of the stability that people might have if they choose to take it up. So I think encouraging the bravery, and then also being there for each other, and trying to create those spaces where we're in conversation and holding up the voices of, in Indigenous communities, it's really important to speak to our elders and to listen to them without an agenda. It's not an extractive listening. It's like we're there to say, try to figure out what they have to tell us. And sometimes that takes a long time. And so I think we have to counter the impatience that we're facing, especially in our classrooms, and try to encourage people to listen.
We have time for one more question, and that is Caitlin.
Hello, my name is Caitlin Gomez. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I heard about this meeting because I'm currently an undergrad at Rutgers University. So I was looking at grad programs, and so somebody advised me, who's actually currently part of the CUNY program, to come to the meeting to kind of like get a feel for the scholars. And I guess my question is in this time, one of the bigger conversations we kind of have, that I've been seeing in a lot of our classes, is political fatigue. A lot of individuals within queer studies have been seeing a lot of political fatigue, especially when it comes to trying to get our voices heard or getting into research and things like that. So I guess the question I kind of want to ask is, how do you keep up the pace in this time where there's so much politics being thrown at you at once, to try to keep pushing that conversation forward, to keep having the academics moving forward, to keep striving to get things published? Like, how do you keep up with this political fatigue that you're kind of facing where there's so many issues at the forefront?
Could offer that there isn't a sharp division between a field note and a journal. And so if you were to if we are all going to care for ourselves through this time, we can track the experience. Sometimes writing helps, sometimes it doesn't. But if writing were to help, maybe there's a way in which the recording of the experience reflects its reality, and it acknowledges the depth of what's happening and how hard it is to even understand it. And ethnographers, well, I like to think that we're training ethnographers to remember that field notes don't have to make sense. They're just supposed to be there. So just like a journal, whatever's happening, and maybe that becomes a way, I don't know, maybe there'll be a moment when the politics that one's experiencing feels like they've paused just enough to go back to that and be like, what did I learn from this? And then there becomes the possibility for it to have a bigger meaning. And it isn't just something that happened to us. I hope that's a helpful reflection.
And none of us know the answer to that, I think. If that's any consolation. Yeah. And that seems like exactly the thing to stay in it. Not necessarily in the super productivist mode, but to stay in relation and to stay with your politics and to stay with the work that seems like it really matters. Yeah, exactly. These are tough times, but it's not the first time, as Gail just pointed out. Thank you all for coming. It was wonderful to hear from people. Thank you for giving up your afternoon for this event. The next event in the Queer Globalization series is Queer Politics of Solidarity. That is in December. But CLAGS also has another amazing series, year-long series on Power of Leather. And I think up thread in the chat, you can find a link tree for those events. And the first one is coming up October 17th. And that one is Black Kink, is that right? I think so, but check it and correct me if I'm wrong, but that should be an amazing series too. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to the panelists for your brilliance, and hope everybody has a wonderful evening.